Thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to say a few words. From the federal perspective, I want to say that it's great to be back in Maine. I just returned a couple weeks ago after serving for about 19 months down in D.C. And I just want to remember that there was one speech that I gave in Kansas in which somehow on my bio it mentioned that I was an 11th generation Mainer. And so afterwards, I decided to strike that because afterwards somebody came to me and said, you know, it was right before lunch and they gave you your bio, gave the bio, and not only was I about to listen for a long time to a federal bureaucrat, but also an inbred one. And I thought, oh, but I can return that to my bio now that I'm in Maine, because you guys all understand that that happens sometimes here in Maine. Let me just say a couple words about sort of my thinking about education in general and where we are, and then talk about the federal perspective and what Secretary Duncan, I think, was trying to achieve and is trying to achieve in D.C. The first thing is that my experience from an education point of view really comes from my experience as a high school teacher. It's what I wanted to do. I graduated from Morse High School down in Bath and went away to college, and after I got my master's degree when I was about 23, came back to Maine to coach debate with Joan and to coach basketball. Of course, those are the two most important things, but I also taught some social studies on the side. And I have to say there are a couple things about that that's really important. The thing that I didn't know when I was a young teacher, and for those of you who are thinking about it, that Yeats once said that the spirit of education, the purpose of education, is to light fires, not to fill buckets. And if you start with that philosophy, education becomes not just something that you have to grind through to achieve, but it becomes the really core of your being throughout your lifetime. The second thing that I didn't understand was about the school itself. That the schools that were really successful were doing three things. And when I was on the education committee in the legislature, we looked at a bunch of schools that what we call added value schools. And at that time, there were about 10 or 12 schools in the state that had their MEAs. Remember, the MEAs are your testing system. And these high schools were what we call added value high schools. And we said, how come they're doing better than their socioeconomic status, which, by the way, is probably the #1 predictor of how you do educationally, sadly, although we have to believe that we as teachers can make a difference in that. I do believe that. But if you look statistically and from an aggregate point of view, what is it that happened in these schools? And so we decided to send a researcher from the University of Southern Maine. If we knew how great Bates was, we would have sent them from Bates, out to look at these 12 schools, and it came back with a simple conclusion. High expectations and good relationships between teachers and students. So how did these schools overcome socioeconomic barriers? They built in excellent relationships between teachers and students, and they expected a lot from their students. They believed that their students could achieve. The third and final piece that I would argue in education, I think in terms of framing some of the things that should be said, is that we have yet to really look in this country about what good assessments look like. So I was a high school teacher without knowing too much, although I had gone to very good schools and all that, and Ted Sizer was my instructor, and he taught me all the great things about the coalition that come out of the idea of a coalition of essential schools. In reality, I sat in front of a classroom and didn't have a clue. But what I found later was that the assessment system that you use will determine exactly where you're going. And so I did what every teacher does. I had 18 chapters in history, and I plopped through the 18 chapters 2 weeks at a time and gave a test every other Friday and lots of quizzes. And by the way, just parenthetically, by about November, about 10 or 12%, 15, maybe 20% of my class had no mathematical chance of passing that course, which is a disciplinary disaster, by the way. And so you just built it on this, just keep on marching through to June. And then finally, a couple of my fellow social studies teachers said to me, what do you suppose it looks like in reality to be a really good social studies graduate? How would we even know you were? And we bizarrely came up with the idea that if you could stand in front of the community for 25 minutes or 35 minutes, and you could put forward a public policy idea and go rigorously using sociology, economics, history, that you could use all of the public policy knowledge that you had, you could rigorously stand and defend that idea at 17 or 18, 19 or 16 years old, then you were a pretty good social studies teacher. And then we looked at each other and said, we're not testing that. How about if we decide to redesign our classroom in a way that said at the end of every year we're going to bring in 60 people from the region, from the local community into this high school, and every kid gets 35 minutes in front of the community. Could we possibly change the nature of what we're teaching? Let me tell you, it did. First of all, the kids had to know this stuff because you had all these very well-positioned adults coming into the school. And secondly, it taught us to teach things that we weren't thinking about. How to work together, how to communicate, how to problem solve, how to bring a task to completion. And that happens to be, and this is the link to the larger federal issue, those are the key issues that employers are looking for. They're the key issues that make your life rich and meaningful, and they're the things that can help you set things on fire rather than fill buckets. So as a result, when we look at where federal policy is going, not surprisingly, we have to have A, better assessment systems. So we are working on that. B, we need to have a better understanding of what relationships and relevance means in our curriculum. And 3, we need to think about what is most important and essential for us to learn. So the policies from the federal perspective are built on those. And I can talk in more detail about the Race to the Top legislation. We can talk about the Race to the Top assessments. We can talk about our I-3 grants, our innovation grants, and all those things. But it's built on those 3 basic ideas. Thank you.